Welcome to a special broadcast. My name is Anthony Martinez. Today we are joined by the legendary journalist Dan Rather. As the first journalist to break the news of President Kennedy's death to instilling common confidence in the wake of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, Dan Rather has covered every major news story of our time. Dan Rather has covered every presidential campaign since 1952 and has interviewed every president since Harry Truman. He was the White House correspondent for CBS News during the administrations of President Johnson and Nixon, and was a leading force in the broadcast news investigation of the Watergate scandal. During the 1960s, as the chief of CBS Southwest Bureau, Rather reported from the flashpoints on the civil rights struggle in the South. Rather retired as the anchorman and managing editor of the CBS Evening News in 2005 after 24 years at the news desk. Rather's latest venture is the hard-edged news show Dan Rather Reports, broadcasted on HDNet, on which he acts as both the host and the managing editor. With his renowned in-depth interviews and love of investigative reporting, Rather is able to accurately report on the major issues facing our nation today, from politics and the global economy to international affairs and the environment. He gives each story the time and commitment that it deserves. Today, Dan Rather will join us to discuss his legacy, the current state of journalism, and the current political climate. Mr. Rather, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's begin with recent events. In Arizona, Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords' shooting rampage. Much of the news afterwards was about the political climate that's in America right now. After the Kennedy assassination, you noted that it was attributed to the political climate in Dallas among conservatives.
Right.
What do you think that journalists can do, politicians can do, and Americans as a whole can do to prevent a heinous act like this from happening again?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that there is no guarantee that this kind of act won't happen again. In fact, the odds are very strong that it will happen again. But I think what we can do is follow President Obama's lead when he called for, this is obviously not a direct quote, that we need to sort of take a deep breath, pause, think about how lucky we are to be in this country, and to understand that we can differ, we can have our differences, but they're best expressed and the national debate is best carried on in an atmosphere of civility and mutual respect. I think that's the best we can do. We have gone through these things before, as you mentioned, the assassination of President Kennedy, the assassination of the late great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., assassination of Bobby Kennedy, attempts on former Alabama Governor, the late George Wallace. We've gone through these things. And it is true that after Dallas, it was said that the political climate there, probably, a very important word, probably contributed. But given the facts as best we know them about these assassinations carried out by loners, people who had some kind of mental difficulty and or narcissistic desire to gain respect and notoriety, we know there's no way to prevent them, but we also know that there are ways to keep the climate where we keep these kinds of things to an absolute minimum.
And going on, Congressman Giffords, immediately after the shooting, NPR reported incorrectly that she had died. And you were quoted in an AP article as saying that if you were covering the story in the 1970s and the 1980s, you would not likely have gone with the NPR report, as many other news organizations did.
Right.
However, you said if you were in the anchor chair in 2011, you probably would have. Why?
Well, because the pressure would have been tremendous, no excuses. The pressure would have been tremendous to go. The media climate has changed so dramatically and so swiftly in the last few years. The pressure is on if somebody, particularly someone as well respected as NPR, reports something. Two things come into play. One is the competitive pressure. Again, no excuse. I'm trying to explain what happens. One is the competitive pressure. And the other is the tremendous cut in resources that the CBS News or NBC News or ABC News of 1970, 1980 had many more resources than they have today. Now another contributing, so if that's a contributing factor, you don't have as many people to check. Another contributing factor is the size of the media competitive arena has expanded so greatly with cable television, satellite television, now internet, computers, cell phones, all of this, that once something gets out, it contributes to the pressure of, listen, everybody else, quote, everybody else is carrying it, so the pressure doesn't be carried. And I was trying to be honest with the AP guy, that if, I know in the 1970s, 1980s, somebody said, listen, NPR didn't exist then, but NPR is reporting this and such. You say, well, okay, but we need to confirm it ourselves. Today, the front office will call the newsroom and say, NPR has carried this, and furthermore, AP is carrying it, and 8 other people are carrying it. I think in this particular case, AP didn't. But everybody else is carrying this. Why don't we have it on the air? And that's the way it works.
And you talked about the lack of resources. When you were covering the Vietnam War for Walter Cronkite, it's completely different than today covering the war. War coverage has vastly changed. Can you discuss why it's changed, and is it for the better or for the worse?
Well, I think it's not for the better. And we could spend the rest of this program and the next several days discussing all the reasons. But among the reasons is that at the time of the Vietnam War, keep in mind that there was no such thing as instant coverage. There was no live coverage of the war. There's no way to cover it live. We were shooting film and not videotape. The film had to be shipped somewhere. The film had to be processed. So a really fast coverage out of Vietnam would be a day and a half, and usually what you saw was 3 or 4 days. It happened 3 or 4 days ahead of time. Now there's a deadline every nanosecond, and that again, once again, I'm not the vice president in charge of excuses, but when you have a deadline every nanosecond and the ability to get up live from anywhere on the planet, Iraq, Afghanistan, where have you, it just creates pressures all around, and unfortunately, journalism, including this journalist, we succumb to those pressures. I'm not proud of it. I think we have a lot to answer for, but that's the way it is.
Right. And on that note, we're going to take a quick commercial break. Much more with Dan Rather when we return. Back with legendary news anchor Dan Rather. Mr. Rather, what do you think of the Keith Olbermann situation that recently happened over the weekend? He ended his contract early with NBC.
Right.
What do you think has been the impact of Keith Olbermann on journalism and in cable news?
Well, I don't know the details. I don't know anybody who knows the details of Keith Olbermann leaving. But like him or not like him, or be mixed in your opinion or have no opinion, he changed the whole landscape of cable television because he took MSNBC as their primetime anchor in the direction of partisan journalism. That's not a criticism. This was a response to Fox being partisan on the right. Olbermann, I think, rightly saw an opening for partisan journalism on the left, and by doing so, I'd say he changed the landscape and had tremendous impact. He has a long record, Keith does, of having difficulty with people above him, corporate masters, if you will, of networks. And so I'm not surprised. I think it's a loss, but I'm not surprised that he left. And I'd be very interested to know when we finish digging into what, if any, influence Comcast buying NBC had on this decision. Now, Comcast says a version of, we didn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
NBC said, listen, that's too far-fetched. But
Well,
one wonders.
You've criticized in the past media conglomerates and these corporate ownerships and how few companies own most of the major news outlets. What do you think will be the effect on NBC News with this merger with Comcast?
Well, the direct and straight and honest answer is, I don't know. But if the past is prologue, it may not be all that good for NBC News and therefore for the news-consuming American public. That I have spoken out before over a number of years about this, that as we sit here tonight, no more than 6, and by my count 4 or 5, large international conglomerate companies control something more than 80% of the true national news coverage of news in this country. That's not a healthy thing for us. I don't know how to reverse it, but I think it should be reversed, and I think someone should be thinking very carefully about it, because as recently as the 1950s, we had some 55 to 57 different media outlets that could be called truly national distribution or very wide regional distribution. Now we have only 6 at most, and as I say, 4 or 5. This is not healthy. It's not healthy for journalism, and therefore it's not healthy for the country. But I have spoken about the corporatization, the politicalization, and the trivialization of news. I think anybody who watches television, listens to radio, reads newspapers with any regularity would, whatever their political persuasion, would agree with that.
When I was growing up watching you, Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw, nightly news has vastly changed since those days.
That it has.
Now you have Diane Sawyer, Katie Couric, and Brian Williams. What do you see nightly news in the future changing to?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature and by experience, but it's hard to be optimistic about the evening newscasts. We're talking about the newscasts that come on at 5:30, 6:30, or 7 o'clock, the national newscasts. Their audiences are down dramatically, tremendously. And that's a direct result of what I called before the enlarged competitive pit. It would not surprise me to see one of the so-called big three networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, drop their evening news over the next 3 to 5 years. Wouldn't surprise me at all. That it's a bit of a dinosaur of edge of the business, mixed metaphors, but it's a dinosaur in its way that very seldom do I run across anybody who watches the evening news anymore. Their audience has gotten older.
Well, they have more of an audience than Bill O'Reilly does, and he's...
That's true. They have, and the cumulative audience for them, that is, if you take all three, the newscast in the Eastern Time Zone is on at 6:30, their cumulative audience is probably still, I would guess, 18 million sets in use. That would be more than 18 million people watching. When I began the CBS Evening News as anchor and managing editor, succeeding Walter Cronkite in 1981, I think that figure was about 27, 28, maybe as many as 30 million. So it's shrinking. But it is a little unfair to the evening newscasts, and you mentioned the three main anchors, all three of them very good professionals, that it's a little unfair in this sense that people, if a Bill O'Reilly, or for that matter, a Keith Olbermann gets what for cable is a large audience.
1.1 million.
Yes. If, let's say, Bill O'Reilly would get, 2 to maybe 3 million sets in use at night, don't hold me to the figure, maybe more or less, and Keith Olbermann gets 1 million, then everybody pays attention to that. Whereas the big three newscasts, which are getting far larger audiences, even the least of them would get at least double that. It's a little unfair. But listen, life is unfair and not all of journalism is fair.
True. How do you think journalists and the media in general have covered the Obama administration thus far?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of coverage, hasn't it? It depends on where you're watching, where you're reading, where you're listening. I think overall in the main, the coverage has been pretty good. I think it has been fair. That he went through a period when he first came into his presidency, I would say 6 to 8 months into the presidency, where he seemed to be out of touch with much of what was happening in the country. This is par for the course for any president in the White House. It is a bit of a bubble, and particularly for first-term presidents. But I think the coverage overall has been pretty fair.
Right, and on that note, we're going to take another commercial break. We'll be right back with legendary newsman Dan Rather.
Thank you.
Welcome back. We're joined by former CBS Evening News anchor Dan Rather. Mr. Rather, what do you see as the future of journalism for us journalism students here at American University?
Well, the most important question is the future of journalism for the country, because a free and independent, truly independent, fiercely when independent, when necessary press is the red beating heart of democracy. And journalism right now is in crisis. Nobody can quite see the future. The old model, the model that allowed bureaus to be overseas, have large staffs, that model, that business model is gone. No new model has really taken its place. So journalism is in what the Catholic Church calls an interregnum. The old order is gone, the new order is not yet in place. Somebody will figure out a way, I'm very hopeful, to do the kind of investigative journalism which I like to do and which I think is so important, and to do meaningful international coverage, which, as you know, has shrunk tremendously over the years. For journalism students, I just smile and say, if you burn with a hot, hard flame to do it, if you have a passion to do it, if you love to do it, if this is what you want your life to be about, then despite all the troubles and American journalism being in crisis at the moment, you'll find a way as a student. But the students always preach the gospel of learn to write. If you learn to write and learn to write well, that's the bedrock of the craft. You may not be wealthy or famous or well known, but you'll always be able to make a living at it. And
you talked about investigative reporting. You do plenty of that on your HDNet show, Dan Rather Reports. Can you just talk about that? I recently read that your crew has been in Alaska because they're working on a profile on the senator who won in
We have.
the write-in candidate.
Well, this is an hour-long program which premieres each week on Tuesday nights and then is repeated during the week on HDNet, which is owned by Mark Cuban out of Dallas. It's also available on iTunes. Our DNA is investigative reporting. We also have a strong inclination to do overseas reporting. I'm just back from a trip to the Middle East, and we like to cover politics. That's where our focus is. We don't do reporting about celebrities. We very seldom do interviews with book authors and that sort of thing. Our hardcore is investigative journalism, and I'm very proud of what we do, and I've never had a better time in my life in my whole career.
You ended your last show on CBS Evening News in 2005 with the tagline, "Courage."
I did.
How can future journalists, be courageous, in your opinion?
Well, not easily, particularly these days, because the pressure's on to go along, get along, and to move with the herd. And the pressure's always been there, but never as great as it is now. That I've never really had courage, but I like the word. It was my father's favorite word. And I did sign off the last newscast I did for CBS News with it, partly in memory of my father, but also, you know, our country's going through a very difficult time. People are having a difficult time. I've always thought it's worth reminding people, just to say any of us can have courage at every moment of every day. But if we aspire to have it, then we'll either get it or something very close to it.
And on that note, I thank you for joining us.
Thank
this
you very
evening.
much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for this ATV Special Broadcast. Make sure to check us online at auatv.com. Thank you for watching.